Hi, this is Matt Baker. Welcome to episode 4 in my series on the evolutionary tree of life. In the first 3 episodes, we covered the animal kingdom, including insects, fish, reptiles, birds, and mammals. So today we're going to switch things up and focus on the other 2 kingdoms, fungi and plants. Now, the main difference between the 3 kingdoms boils down to how each one obtains its food. Animals, including us humans, have to eat our food, meaning that we have to literally take other life forms, put them in our bodies, and then let our internal digestive systems do some processing. Similarly, fungi also need to obtain their food from other sources. But a fungus doesn't need to ingest its food because it has the ability to absorb it externally. But plants are super special because they alone have the ability to make their own food through a process called photosynthesis. They can do this because they have little green cell parts called chloroplasts that take energy from the sun and turn it into sugar. Interestingly, the word chloroplast comes from the Greek and literally means green thing that makes. Now, back in episode 1, I explained where these little green cell parts came from. They were originally a type of cyanobacteria. Again, the word cyan comes from the Greek and refers to a sort of greenish-bluish color. But then, around 1 billion years ago, an endosymbiosis event occurred whereby that bacteria entered a larger eukaryote cell to create the first archaeplastid. From there, we got a form of multicellular life called algae, which comes in green, red, and brown. Algae are similar to true plants in that they can perform photosynthesis, but they differ in that they're far more simple and live exclusively in the water. Now, before we move on to the actual plant kingdom, let me once again remind you that if you want to get a copy of this chart, all you need to do is head over to usefulcharts.com or just click the link in the description or pinned comment. Okay, so the first major split within the plant kingdom is between vascular plants and non-vascular plants. Vascular plants have a network of veins, kind of like we animals do, but whereas our veins carry blood, plant veins carry water and nutrients. Together, plant veins make up all the various features that we tend to associate with plants, things like roots, stems, branches, and leaves. But not all plants have these things. Those that don't, i.e. the non-vascular plants, belong to the Bryophyta division. Take note that when it comes to plants and fungi, the word division is used in place of phylum. The type of Bryophyta that you're probably the most familiar with is moss, that spongy green stuff that spreads out over surfaces but never grows very tall. This is because bryophytes need to stay close to moisture, since it was in water that plants originally evolved. However, vascular plants do much better on land and can grow much higher thanks to their stems and branches, which A, provide them with structure, and B, help transport water up. If you've ever cut a carrot, you may have noticed that it has a little circle inside a bigger circle. Well, all plant stems and branches are similar. The circle in the middle is called the xylem, which in ancient Greek means wood. Its job is to carry water and minerals up from the ground to the top of the plant. In contrast, the outer circle is called the phloem, and it serves as a two-way pipe, carrying sugar, the byproduct of photosynthesis, to every part of the plant. Okay, the next split on the chart divides the vascular plants into those with seeds and those without seeds. Those without belong to the Pteridophyta division, pterid meaning ferns. So ferns, like most other plants, do have branches and leaves, but since they don't have seeds, they reproduce in a slightly different way. If you look on the underside of a fern leaf, you'll notice a bunch of tiny little bumps. These are called sori, and they are full of spores. Spores differ from seeds in that they are produced asexually. Which brings me to the whole topic of plant sex. Most plants produce seeds, and seeds are basically little embryos, meaning that in order to create one, you need both a female and a male, or at least a female part and a male part. But before I dive into that, I need to point out that seed-bearing plants can be divided into two main categories, angiosperms and gymnosperms. Angiosperms are also known as flowering plants, but they could also be called fruit-bearing plants because only plants with flowers produce fruit. And what is fruit? Well, fruit is simply a special container for seeds. In fact, the word angiosperm literally means container seed. This is in contrast with gymnosperm, which means naked seed. Now, when it comes to gymnosperms, most people tend to think only of conifers, or cone-bearing plants, almost all of which are evergreen. But there are actually a few other types of gymnosperms as well, such as the ginkgo tree, which loses its leaves. So what unites all gymnosperms is not cones or being evergreen, but the fact that their seeds aren't enclosed in fruit. Let's look at the well-known pine tree as an example. When I say pine cone, you probably think of this. But this is actually just one kind of pine cone, the female kind. On the same tree, you'll also find these ones, which are the male kind. So I guess we could say that pine trees, at least most species of pine, are hermaphrodites, meaning that they are both male and female at the same time. What happens is this. The male pine cone releases pollen, some of which blows in the wind and enters the female pine cones, where it combines with ova to form embryos, or seeds. These seeds then grow, and when they are ready, the female cone releases them in a mostly naked form, i.e. without fruit. Some angiosperms, such as pumpkin plants for example, reproduce in a similar way, except instead of cones, they have flowers. And instead of producing mere seeds, they produce fruit, with the seeds on the inside. So for example, on a pumpkin plant, you'll find two different types of flowers. Although they look quite similar, one type will be male and the other type will be female. Once the female flower is pollinated, the fruit, in this case the pumpkin, starts to develop at the bottom of the flower. Over time though, the flower fades away and the pumpkin gets bigger and bigger. Now, there are actually two other ways that seed-bearing plants can reproduce. For example, most willow trees are either male or female. So in this case, some trees produce only male flowers and others produce only female flowers. But it's actually the final way that is used by most angiosperms. Most angiosperms produce just one type of flower, but that flower is both male and female at the same time. Sometimes called perfect flowers, they have both stamen, which are the male parts, and carpels, which are the female parts. But angiosperms are not actually classified by how they reproduce. Instead, they are classified by how their seeds grow, the two main types being monocots and dicots. Cot refers to cotyledons, which are plants' very first leaves. If you've ever tried to grow plants from seeds, you've probably noticed that these sprouts usually look something like this. Those two initial leaves are the cotyledons. And since there are two of them, we know that this plant is a dicot. Grass, on the other hand, is a monocot, so when it sprouts, it looks like this. Another good example is to think of a corn kernel versus a peanut. A corn kernel is a monocot seed, which is why it's just a single piece, whereas a peanut is a dicot seed, which is why you can split it in two. Most dicots are eudicots, meaning true dicots. But there's also magnolid dicots, which are some of the oldest angiosperms still around. As the name suggests, this group includes magnolias, but it also has avocado, cinnamon, laurels, black pepper, and radiator plants, which are one of the more popular types of houseplants, coming in lots of different varieties. If you have a peperomia plant at home, you'll notice that its flowers look more like long, thin cones than normal flowers. That's a reminder that it belongs to the oldest category of flowering plants, going all the way back to when flowers were still evolving from cones. Let's look at monocots next. This is where we find almost all of the plants that start out as bulbs, like onions and garlic, as well as lilies and tulips. But it's also where we find major tropical fruits, like coconuts, bananas, and pineapples. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, it contains all of the grasses, which include the world's 3 largest food crops: wheat, rice, and corn. But now comes the big category, the eudicots, or true dicots. This group contains about 75% of all flowering plant species, most of which only evolved relatively recently, after the extinction of the dinosaurs. Eudicots are mostly split into either rosids or asterids. But before we look at them, let me point out a few exceptions. Two of the oldest eudicot families are the lotus family and the buttercup family, which also includes poppies, from which we get opium. Then there's the Caryophyllales order, which includes all of the various types of cactuses, as well as the famous Venus flytrap, one of the few examples of a carnivorous plant. It also includes carnations and the Amaranthaceae family, which contains spinach and beets. Okay, let me now introduce you to rosids and asterids, the two main categories of eudicots. The terms come from the names of two famous flowers, the rose and the aster, or daisy. Although, take note that aster literally means star. That's because asters look like stars. Not this kind, but this kind, which we call an asterisk. Now, the really neat thing about daisy-like flowers, such as the sunflower, is that each flower is actually a constellation of many tiny little flowers. Even each petal is technically its own flower, having evolved from multiple petals that fused together. But the asterid category contains more than just fancy flowers. It also includes many plants that we eat and drink, such as carrots, coffee, olives, and the Lamiaceae family, which includes most herbs, such as mint, basil, oregano, and thyme. And then there's the Solanaceae family, also known as nightshades, which is ironic because sol means sun. So is this a sun-related family or a night-related family? Well, the origin of the term nightshade is debated, but one thought is that it's because some of the plants in this family are quite dangerous, ranging from poisonous berries that can kill you immediately to tobacco, which, if you smoke enough of it, will kill you over time. But it also includes many plants that are not dangerous, like potatoes and tomatoes. Which brings me to the age-old question, is a tomato a fruit or a vegetable? Well, the answer may surprise you. It's actually both. From a botanist's point of view, it's a fruit. That's because it's a seed container that grows out of a flower. However, from a culinary point of view, it's a vegetable. That's because the word vegetable is actually an arbitrary term used for any part of a plant that is edible but not sweet. So vegetables can be leaves, like spinach, stems, like celery, seeds, like lentils, flowers, like broccoli, roots, like carrots, bulbs, like onions, or even fruit, like tomatoes. Another part of certain plants that can be edible are tubers, which are a part of the root system. The most famous tuber is, of course, the potato. So if you've ever wondered why potatoes and tomatoes can be so closely related yet look so different, now you know why. They are simply different parts of a plant. Let's now move over to the rosids. There is actually no foolproof way to tell the difference between a rosid plant and an asterid plant just by looking at them, because the technical difference has to do with seed formation. However, generally speaking, rosid plants usually have more obvious stipules, which are those little things that stick out between a branch and a leaf stem. Unlike asterids, rosids include both small plants as well as big ones, aka trees. A tree is defined as any large plant with a central trunk. We've already run across trees in the conifer section, but those were the evergreen ones. When it comes to deciduous trees, meaning those that lose their leaves in the autumn, they are mostly found here among the rosids, such as elms, oaks, maples, and willows. However, rosids also include many edible plants, such as squash, beans, grapes, citrus fruits, and cacao, which is used to make chocolate. And then, very closely related to the rose flower itself are apples, as well as peaches, plums, and all the various red berries. Now, I should point out that when it comes to roses, the ones you're likely familiar with don't actually occur in nature. A wild rose, like most eudicots, only has 5 petals. The many-petaled roses that people like to give to their lovers are the result of many decades of human cultivation. Okay, so that takes care of the plant kingdom. For the rest of this video, we're going to take a look at fungi. For many centuries, fungi were considered to be plants, but we now know that they are actually more closely related to animals, having split off from a common ancestor about 1 billion years ago. The study of fungi is called mycology, from the Greek word mykes, meaning mushroom. But there are a lot of other types of fungi beyond just mushrooms. A good example is bread mold, which is considered a lower fungi. If you let it grow, you'll notice that it creates a huge network of tiny little threads. These are called hyphae, and even mushrooms have them. It's just that in that case, they are usually underground. It is the hyphae that does what fungi are best known for, decomposing organic material. So for example, if you let molds grow on an apple, the apple will eventually disappear, and you'll be left with a puddle of brown goop. That's because the fungi will have basically eaten the apple. Higher fungi can be divided into two main divisions: Basidiomycota, meaning club-like fungus, and Ascomycota, meaning sac-like fungus. Ascomycota includes common molds, as well as fungi that creates a symbiotic relationship with algae to create lichen. However, it also includes yeast, both the type that causes infections, as well as the type used to make bread. It does this by eating the sugar in the flour, creating gas that then causes the bread to rise. Another example of the fact that fungi can be either good or bad is these two closely related types. Again, one type creates infections for humans, such as ringworm and athlete's foot. But the other type is used to make the antibiotic penicillin. Remember, fungi are good at eating or destroying things. So in the case of penicillium, what the fungi destroys is bad bacteria. So we've just learned how to use this to our advantage. Under Ascomycota is also truffles. Besides mushrooms, truffles are the other main type of fungi that humans eat. However, they are far more rare and thus usually quite expensive. The final thing I want to mention in terms of Ascomycota is Prototaxites. I haven't included them on this chart, but long ago, around the same time that the first vertebrates walked on land, this giant fungus was actually the largest organism on land, about as tall as a 3-story building. Okay, let's now look at Basidiomycota, and in particular, the Agaricomycetes class. The word agaric is the technical term for any fungi that produces mushrooms, in particular the kind with a rounded cap with gills underneath. We tend to think of the mushroom part of an agaric as being its main part, but in actual fact, it's simply the equivalent of its fruit. In other words, a mushroom is the part of the fungus responsible for reproduction, in this case by producing spores. The main part of an agaric, or any fungi for that matter, is actually the network of hyphae that I mentioned earlier, which in this case is located underneath the mushroom. The largest mushroom order is actually the Polyparalis order, which includes all of the shelf fungi that grow on the side of trees. In contrast, the main type of edible mushroom, Agaricus bisporus, also known as button mushrooms, belongs to the Agaricales order, which also includes shiitake mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms, and the super poisonous deathcap mushroom. But perhaps the most recognizable mushroom of all, made famous by the Super Mario game, is Amanita muscarius, known commonly as the fly agaric, because it can be used to kill flies. Okay, so that was a look at the plant and fungi kingdoms, which means that I've now covered everything on the chart. However, I am going to do one more video in this series, in which I look at some additional charts that help explain how we know that evolution is true. As a reminder, if you want to get a copy of the chart, just head over to our website, usefulcharts.com, or click the link in the description, pinned comment, or on screen in a few seconds. Thanks for watching.